Why were women in mid-20th century America dissatisfied with their lives? That's the question Betty Friedan sought to answer in her seminal text, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan called this dissatisfaction the problem with no name. Women would shop for groceries, chauffeur their children around, and lie beside their husbands at night. Throughout, they would find themselves asking, "Is this all?" However, Friedan argued, efforts by women to understand or express this dissatisfaction were generally dismissed as neurotic. Friedan's thesis was that the traditional expectations of femininity masked women's real identities. Friedan called these traditional characterizations of women the feminine mystique. She suggested that a cultural belief in the feminine mystique conflicts with women's personal identity and intellectual capacity. This results in neglect and harmful identity crises in women. Friedan also criticized Freud's notion that this crisis was penis envy. She argued that women who behave like men, for example by entering a male-dominated workforce, are not trying to acquire masculinity. Instead, they're seeking to find their own personal identity while rejecting the feminine mystique idea of women as housewives. Friedan concluded by encouraging women to fight against the feminine mystique. She argued that women should cultivate their true identity and intellectual capacity through meaningful employment. To get a clearer insight into Friedan's analysis, let's consider an example. Penny is a secretary to a powerful businessman in 1960s New York. Her boss expects her to be charming and well-dressed, or in other words, to live according to the feminine mystique. Penny's boss has no expectations about Penny's intellectual capability, but internally, Penny understands the complexities of how the business functions. She wishes to make a contribution to key decisions or even run the business herself. She begins to get frustrated in her job, as all it requires is to fit the external expectations of men. This dissatisfaction is Friedan's problem with no name. Friedan's advice to Penny would be to find employment which encourages her intellectual capacity and personal expression. The feminine mystique was a significant milestone in the beginning of second-wave feminism. This was a movement from the 1960s to the 1980s, which spurred on the entrance of women into the workplace.